Wyoming Territory. Autumn of 1878, the wind cut low across the plains outside of Laramie, stirring dust over the wagon tracks as Prudence Barnett stepped off the eastbound stage with nothing but a canvas bag and the weight of a past no one wanted to forget. The town she once called home had cast her out 4 years ago. Folks whispered about her even now, though most wouldn't say it to her face. She had been 19 then, too young and too full of hope, and when she lost both her parents in a fire and took up work at the Silver Queen Saloon to keep her younger brother fed, the whispers started. When her brother died of fever that winter and the saloon's owner tried to pull her into his bed, Prudence had knocked out 2 of his teeth with a whiskey bottle. The sheriff gave her until sundown to leave town. Now, at 23, she had come back because there was nowhere else left to go. The boardwalk creaked beneath her boots as she walked past the mercantile, the stables, and the church that shut its doors in her face once upon a time. She kept her chin high and her eyes forward. Her black coat was worn at the elbows, her gloves patched, but her spine was straight. She had not come crawling. The only place that would offer her a roof was a ranch out west of town. Hired help needed, no questions asked. The man who owned it was a war veteran with a bad leg and no family, according to the woman at the boarding house. "Name's Vance Thorne," she had said. "Keeps to himself, knows how to mind his own business. Maybe that's what you need." It was a half-day's ride on a borrowed mare. The land stretched wide and golden, the sky so big it made her chest ache. When she finally saw the outline of the ranch house and the small barn beside it, relief made her legs weak. He met her at the gate. Vance Thorne was not what she expected. He was younger than she thought, maybe 30 at most, with dark blonde hair that curled at the ends and eyes the color of iron. He leaned on a cane like it was part of him, his left leg stiff, but he stood tall. "You the one sent from the boarding house?" he asked. "I am. You know how to handle horses?" "I do." He studied her face for a second longer than was polite, then nodded once. "You'll start in the morning." She did not ask for kindness, and he did not offer it. But that first night, as she cleaned out the bunkhouse and shook mice from the blanket, he brought her a plate of stew and left without a word. Days passed. Then a week. She worked hard, kept quiet, and didn't ask questions. Vance had 2 ranch hands, older men who mostly kept to themselves, and a dozen horses he bred and trained for cavalry contracts. Prudence had a way with them. She moved slow, talked soft. The horses calmed under her touch. Vance noticed. "You got a gift," he said one morning, watching her coax a nervous filly into the corral. "They trust you. They do not have reason not to." That made him pause. After that, he started riding alongside her more. He did not talk much, but he listened. And when he did speak, it was careful and plain. Then the snow came early. It was late October when she found the boy. She had been out gathering firewood from the edge of the forest when she heard the cough. Harsh, wet. She followed the sound and found him curled under a pine tree, barely conscious, wrapped in a thin blanket and shivering so hard his teeth clicked. He could not have been more than 6. She carried him back in her arms, her coat wrapped around him, her heart pounding. Vance opened the door when she kicked it. "There is a child," she said. "Help me." His eyes widened, but he took the boy from her arms without hesitation. They laid him on the couch and stoked the fire. Prudence warmed broth and fed it to him spoonful by spoonful. He did not speak until morning. "My name's Kellan," he whispered. "My mama told me to hide. She never came back." Prudence smoothed the hair from his forehead. "You are safe now." They never found the mother. The sheriff figured she had been caught in the storm and did not make it out. Kellan had no other family. Vance did not ask questions. He built a small bed in the corner of the main house and told the boy he could stay as long as he liked. Prudence stayed close to him after that. She braided his hair in the morning and taught him how to brush the horses. At night, she read aloud from old books by the fire while he fell asleep curled against her side. She had not known how much her heart ached for the sound of a child's laughter until she heard it again. One night, Vance watched her tuck Kellan in and lingered beside the doorway as she smoothed the boy's blanket. "You have a good way with him," he said. She looked at him, eyes tired but warm. "I had a younger brother once." "I remember." He nodded, silent, then said, "You do not talk much about what came before. I learned not to." "I do not think less of you for it." She blinked, startled. He held her gaze with quiet strength. "I think more." After that night, something shifted. He brought her coffee in the morning. She mended the sleeve of his coat. They fell into rhythm, two people who had lost more than they said, building something steady and real. One evening, as the wind howled outside and snow piled high against the windows, Kellan asleep between them on the rug, Vance looked over at her. The firelight caught the gold in his eyes. "I used to think love was something soft," he said. "Like a song or a flower, but it is not. It is staying. It is choosing to stay." Prudence reached for his hand. "I've never stayed anywhere before," she said. "Not really." He curled his fingers through hers, firm and warm. "Then stay here." His voice was rough but sure. "With me," she nodded once, eyes brimming. Yes, and she meant it. By mid-November, the snow had settled into a hush that blanketed the ranch in a kind of stillness Prudence had never known. Some mornings, frost limned the barn door in white lace, and her breath curled like wood smoke as she walked out before light to check on the horses. Inside, Vance had taken to rising early too, making coffee in the cast iron pot while Kellan sprawled beneath the quilt, one arm flung over his eyes. The house had grown full in ways that had nothing to do with space. That morning, the stove's fire had burned low, and Prudence was bent over it feeding kindling when Vance came in from the shed, snow in his hair and a rolled oilcloth in his hand. "I found something you might use," he said, setting the bundle on the table. She turned, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it?" "Old tack tools. My brother used them before the war." He unrolled the cloth, revealing a set of slender awls, needles, and a stitching clamp. "They've sat in the loft near 10 years. Figured you'd put 'em to better use than dust." She traced a finger along the handle of one awl, worn smooth by time. "You had a brother, Illy," he said. "Younger by 3 years. He didn't come home from Shiloh." Her hands stilled. "I'm sorry," he shrugged, but his eyes didn't move from the tools. "I stopped talking about him after a while. Folks forget easy when it isn't their loss." She folded the cloth gently and set it aside. "Some losses don't leave room for forgetting." Vance didn't answer. He sat instead, pulling off his gloves, and looked toward the window where the snow fell in steady lines. After a pause, he said, "Yesterday, Kellan asked if we were a family." Prudence leaned back against the stove, arms crossed. "What did you tell him?" "I told him families are what you choose, not just what you're born into." She felt something shift low in her chest, a quiet ache, soft and unfamiliar. Later that afternoon, while Kellan napped in the corner with a slate pencil still clutched in his hand, Prudence stood at the barn door watching the wind pull drifts across the pasture fence. Vance was inside shoeing one of the older geldings, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms dusted with ash and sweat. He was humming under his breath, not a tune she recognized, but slow and even, with a kind of patience that made her throat tighten. "I was thinking," she said when he noticed her, "we could take the sleigh into town tomorrow. The mercantile's got winter cloth in, and Kellan needs heavier trousers." He nodded, wiping his arm across his brow. "We can hitch Daisy to the sled." She hesitated, then stepped closer. "You ever think about what comes next?" He looked up at her, the hammer paused in his hand. "Next, when the snow melts, when the cavalry contracts come through, when Kellan gets older." He set the hammer aside and leaned against the stall rail. "I've spent most of my years not planning past spring, wasn't much point to it. And now," he studied her face, something unreadable flickering through his expression. "Now's different." That night she couldn't sleep. She sat near the hearth after Kellan had gone to bed, needle in hand, mending the knee of one of his woolen trousers. The fire cracked low, casting amber light across the worn floorboards. Vance came in without a word, carrying 2 tin mugs. He handed her one and sat beside her on the rug, their shoulders almost touching. He didn't speak for a while. The only sound was the wheeze of wind at the windows and the slow sip of coffee between them. "I don't know how to do this," he said finally. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the fire. "Not just raising a boy, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't have to know, you just have to want to try." "I do." He turned to her then, and the flicker of flame caught the edge of vulnerability in his face. "You're not what I expected. I've learned not to be." He reached out then, slow and deliberate, and brushed his fingers against hers. "I don't care what they said about you, I see who you are here." Her throat tightened, and she looked down at his hand, calloused and steady against her own. "I've spent so long thinking I had to be alone to be safe," she said quietly. "But I don't feel alone anymore." His grip shifted gently, linking their fingers. "Then you're not." She fell asleep that night with her hand in his, the fire burning low and the boy breathing softly in the next room. Wyoming winter held fast around them, but inside, something had begun to thaw. The thaw came slow that year, reluctant and wet. By early March, the snow had receded into thick, rust-colored mud that clung to boots and wheels alike. The river behind the north pasture swelled from ice melt, and the air carried the scent of damp pine and turned earth. On the bluff above the barn, birds began to return sharp-winged and restless, calling out like they'd never left. Inside the main house, Kellan sat at the table, tongue between his teeth as he copied his letters onto a scrap of paper torn from the back of an old ledger. Prudence leaned over his shoulder, hair pulled back in a loose knot, her hands dusted with flour from the biscuit dough she'd left to rise. She pointed at his crooked K. "Try it again," she said. "Start from the top and pull down straight." He pressed harder with the pencil, lifting his chin. "Like this." "Closer," she said, her voice low and warm. Vance stood in the doorway, watching them. His shirt sleeves were rolled, and his hands were raw from fencing. He didn't speak right away. The scene before him, Kellan's brow furrowed in concentration, Prudence's hand resting lightly on the boy's back settled into him like a stone in still water. Later, after Kellan had gone outside to feed the chickens, Vance leaned against the table where Prudence was wiping up crumbs. "You're good with him," he said. She glanced at him, a little amused. "You've told me that before." "No," he shook his head, "not just good. You've given him something to belong to." She folded the cloth with careful hands. "He gives it back, you know, that feeling." Vance nodded once, then sat across from her. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded letter, yellowed at the edges. "Got this from a cousin in Missouri," he said. "He's setting up a contract for cavalry horses near Fort Riley, wants to know if I'll take the breeding stock there myself, could fetch a fair price." She leaned forward slightly. "That's a long ride. 3 weeks, maybe 4. I'd go with the spring train out of Cheyenne, ride the rest." She studied his face, reading more than he said. "You want me to stay here," she said, quiet. "I wouldn't ask," he said. "But I'd want it." She looked toward the window where Kellan was crouched in the dirt, showing something to the red hen with grave seriousness. "I'd keep him safe," she said. "You know that, I do." Prudence turned back, her eyes steady. "When would you leave?" 2 weeks. "Maybe less." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood, poured water into the kettle, and lit the stove. The silence between them wasn't heavy, just full. "I've never been asked to stay," she said finally, her back still to him. "Not because someone needed something, but because they wanted me." He stood too then, crossing to stand behind her. He didn't touch her, just let the warmth of his presence fill the space. "I want you," he said. "I want this." She turned to face him. Her eyes were damp, but her voice didn't waver. "Then go, make the deal, bring back what you need, I'll be here." He didn't kiss her, not yet, but he reached out slowly and took her hand, his thumb brushing the place where her scarred knuckles met her wrist. "I'll come back," he said. "I know." In the days that followed, they prepared quietly. Vance packed the saddle bags, mended his trail coat, checked the tack. Prudence kept the house, taught Kellan how to use the new seed catalog, showed him how to warm kindling on the stove before lighting it. No one mentioned what it would feel like when the door shut behind Vance, though all three of them knew it would be a long silence. The morning he left, it hadn't yet begun to rain, but the clouds hung low and heavy. Vance mounted his bay mare with a practiced stiffness, the pain in his leg something he no longer remarked on. Kellan stood beside Prudence, holding a tin lunch pail they'd packed together. "You better come back with that horse money," the boy said, brows knitted. Vance leaned down and tousled his hair. "I'll come back with more than that." His eyes met Prudence's then, and nothing more needed to be said. She watched him ride out along the muddy road, his figure growing smaller against the pale rise of the hills. Kellan stood quiet beside her, arms tucked into his coat. "He'll come back," Prudence said, not to convince the boy, but because she believed it. "I know," Kellan said. "He's not like other men." She looked down at him, surprised. He shrugged. "He looks at you like he's already home." She didn't answer, just reached down, took his hand, and led him back toward the house. There was laundry to hang and seed to sort, and a pair of curtains she'd been meaning to stitch for the front room. The days would pass. And when Vance returned, she would be waiting. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had finally chosen to stay. The days after Vance's departure unfolded in a quiet rhythm, shaped more by necessity than choice. Prudence rose before first light, her hands red from the pump water and her skirts damp with early spring dew. The sodden ground made chores slower, wheelbarrows sank, fence posts leaned, but she welcomed the work. It kept her moving, and movement left less room for wondering how far he'd gotten or what kind of cold he might be riding through. Kellan adapted quickly. He took to the seed trays with a kind of solemn focus, lining up the corn kernels in rows as straight as fence rails. He didn't ask often about Vance, but he watched the road every afternoon without saying so. Prudence noticed. She didn't speak to it either. One morning a letter arrived. The ranch hand, Emery, brought it in from town after riding in for feed. It was creased and mud smeared at the corners, but Vance's name was clear along the seal. She waited until Kellan was outside before unfolding it. He wrote in blunt, careful strokes. He'd made Fort Laramie ahead of the snowmelt and planned to cross into Nebraska within the week. The herd held steady. He missed the boys' chatter and her biscuits, though he confessed her coffee was better than anything he could brew himself. There was no poetry in it, but his voice came through plain and sure. She read it twice, then folded it and tucked it behind the flour tin. That evening, after the lanterns were lit and Kellan was tracing constellations in a book she'd found at the mercantile, Emery lingered near the hearth, kneading his forearm. "You'll be needing help moving the young stock when the valley thaws," he said without looking up. "I reckon I will," he nodded once. "I can stay on through spring if you want it." Prudence set her jaw, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'd be grateful." He pushed off the wall, paused, then added, "Most around town figured you'd run off after him." She turned. "Did they?" "They don't know much," he said, "but they talk like they do." Her voice stayed even. "I'm not the running kind." He tipped his hat before stepping out into the dark. Later, long after Kellan had fallen asleep across the rug with a blanket tucked around him, Prudence sat by the window, mending a tear in her sleeve. The wick on the lantern burned low. She didn't look out at the road. She didn't need to. The ranch was holding. The next week brought warmth that lingered past midday. The hens laid more regular and the soil behind the barn softened enough to take seed. Prudence showed Kellan how to press the beans in, thumb deep, and cover them gently with dirt. He frowned as he worked. "You think he'll be back before they sprout?" She didn't hesitate. "He will." On the 10th day of April, Emery returned from town with another letter. This one was shorter. Vance had made the sale at Fort Riley. They'd offered more than expected, and he'd bought 2 geldings on trade. He planned to return by the end of the month, weather holding. That evening, Prudence didn't read it again. Instead, she stepped out after supper and walked down past the pasture fence, the hem of her skirt catching on dry thistle. The air smelled of melt and manure, of something waking up after months of sleep. She stood there a long time, just breathing. 2 days later came the storm. It rolled in sudden, with winds that cracked branches and drove sleet sideways. Emery and the other hand got the animals in, but the barn roof lost a plank, and the creek swelled high enough to eat the east fence line. They spent the night moving feed sacks and bedding down the colts in the tack room. Kellan clung to her coat, wide-eyed but quiet. Prudence kept one hand on his shoulder and the other on the lantern, her boots sinking in the muck as they made their way back to the house. By morning, the worst had passed. The roof held. The gate was gone, but the animals were safe. She sent Kellan to fetch dry wood. When he returned, he held something else in his hand. "There's a man common down the ridge," he said. She stepped out onto the porch, shielding her eyes. The rider was slumped low in the saddle, his coat soaked through, horse mud slick and heaving. It took a moment before she recognized the shape of him, the way his legs shifted awkwardly in the stirrup, the set of his shoulders. She didn't move until he was off the horse. It wasn't dramatic. He slid down, nearly stumbled, caught himself. The wind knocked his hat sideways. His eyes found hers, tired and rimmed with travel, and he said nothing. She stepped forward, leaving the door wide. "I thought you'd wait out the storm." "I should have," he said. "But I wanted to be home." She reached him then, her hands on either side of his jaw, not pulling him close, just anchoring him there. "You're soaked through," she said. "Was worth it." She kissed him then, slow and firm, like something that had waited long enough. Kellan whooped from the porch behind them. Vance laughed against her mouth, and she didn't let go. Inside, the stove burned steady and supper waited in the pot. The house smelled of rosemary and wood smoke. When he stepped over the threshold, she didn't look back to see if he would stay. She knew. By late April, the land had turned green in the hollows and pale gold on the slopes. Vance's return settled into the house like a second breath. He slept long the first night, boots still dusted with Kansas soil beside the bed, and when he rose the next morning, it was with a quiet steadiness that hadn't been there before. He brought back more than the promised geldings. He brought a saddlebag of books for Kellan, and a bolt of tobacco-brown calico that he handed to Prudence without a word. She ran her hand over the cloth, rough but strong. "You remembered the measure?" "I remembered your fingers holding the twine," he said. She didn't blush, but her throat moved as she looked away. There was work to be done. The flood had left the lower pasture slick and furrowed, and the new fence posts had to be reset by hand. Vance kept to the heavier lifting, his limp more marked after the long ride, though he didn't speak of it. Prudence noticed when he shifted weight off his left leg without thinking. That evening she filled the tin tub with boiled water and set it by the hearth. "You'll soak that leg," she said. "Or you won't walk come August." He didn't argue. She knelt beside him, washing the trail dust from his calf and shin, her fingers firm. He flinched once when she pressed deep into the muscle. "You rode through the creek, didn't you?" she said. "Didn't have a better choice." His voice stayed even. She didn't ask more. She dried his leg with one of her old cotton petticoats and rose to pour him a cup of broth. That night, with the fire low and Kellan asleep beneath a quilt embroidered with wheat stalks and stars, Vance leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "I used to think I was done with anything permanent," he said. "Didn't see the use." Prudence stood across the room, brushing ashes into the iron pan. "You made things last before. I made things survive. That's not the same." She set the pan down. "And now," he stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "Now I want something that doesn't have to be endured." She looked up at him, and he reached for her, not with urgency but with certainty. His hand cupped the back of her neck, thumb against her pulse. When he kissed her, it was quiet and sure, the kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything but gave everything. The following week, they hitched Daisy and drove to the edge of the valley where the wild grasses had started to grow back. Kellan sat between them, pointing out every ground squirrel and bird he saw. Vance brought along a shovel and a wooden cross he'd carved from spare pine. At the base of a cottonwood, they buried a small pouch of ash and bone that had washed up after the storm, someone's lost kin. No name, no marker, but they stood together while Vance spoke the only words he could. May you find what you were owed in life where you go now. Prudence rested her hand on the boy's shoulder as they walked back to the wagon. The seasons turned. Summer came in with heat that cracked the dirt and made the horses sweat through their coats. Vance and Prudence worked side by side, mending the barn roof with new cedar shingles shipped up from Denver. She hammered while he held boards in place, neither of them speaking much, but every motion was shared. One afternoon, while Kellan chased grasshoppers through the orchard, Vance stood with his hand on the post of the porch and watched Prudence hang washed linens on the line. "I've been thinking," he said. She lifted a clothespin between her teeth and waited. "I want to build a second room onto the house, not for guests." She didn't answer right away. The wind pulled at the sheets, white and wide like sails. "I want to marry you," he said. She turned then, slowly. "You're not asking?" "I'm not good at that," he said, "but I'll try if you want it done proper." She stepped toward him, the sunlight behind her. "No need for proper, just need it real." He took her hand. "It's been real since the day you came walking through the gate." They married in August, beneath the cottonwoods. Emery stood beside Vance, and the schoolteacher from town read from a prayer book with cracked leather edges. Kellan carried a small bouquet of wildflowers and grinned so wide his cheeks hurt. Prudence wore a dress she'd sewn herself from the cloth Vance had brought back. It wasn't white, but it was clean and fit her like it had been waiting its whole life. That night, after the guests had gone and the porch was lit with lanterns, Vance lifted her hand to his lips. "I never thought I'd be loved again," he said. She rested her head against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd be safe." "You are now," he said. "Always." They went inside. The house felt different, not because it had changed, but because it had been claimed. The silence between them wasn't emptiness, it was peace. Years passed. The orchard bore fruit. Kellan outgrew his boots 3 times in 1 year and took to drawing horses in the margins of his school books. Prudence taught him to write his name in firm, even strokes. Vance built the second room and planted cotton down the north field. They watched storms come and go. They watched the valley grow quiet. One autumn evening, with the sky painted in deep rose and the air thick with the scent of wheat, Vance stood behind Prudence as she shelled beans into a tin pan. "I think we did it," he said. She didn't turn. "Did what?" Made something worth keeping. She set the pan down and leaned back against him, his arms closing around her waist. "There's nothing I'd trade it for." He pressed a kiss to the crown of her head. "Me neither." They stayed like that until the light faded, the house behind them warm and full. They had come through fire and frost, through silence and storm, and they had built something from it, not just shelter, but a life that held, a life that lasted.